welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Welcome to Syosset Library's Turn the Page podcast. This is Jessikah. I am really excited to have this author here because this book, Clytemnestra, is like totally my jam. I am a mythology buff, and I just eat up all of these reframing of especially women in mythology. So I'm going to actually stop talking right now, and I'm going to ask the author to introduce herself and tell us about this book.
Well, first of all, Jessikah, thank you so much for having me. I'm really, really excited. So my name is Constanza Casati, and I'm the author of Clytemnestra, which is the feminist retelling of one of ancient history's most infamous heroines. Clytemnestra is quite famous in the myth for being the sister Helen of Troy, and also for murdering her husband, Agamemnon, as he comes back from the Trojan War. And for the people who do not know, Agamemnon was the leader of the Greek forces during the Trojan War. Because of this murder, because of this act, Clytemnestra has been hated and vilified for centuries. And she has been cast as the archetype of the bad, unfaithful wife, as opposed to her cousin Penelope, who's the archetype of the good, faithful wife. So in my novel, I take this character and show readers what an extraordinary woman she actually was. I really follow her life from her time as a Spartan princess up to her ascent to power in the city of Mycenae, which she ruled for 10 years while her husband was away fighting. And in doing so, I explore some of the relationships that she had with some of the most famous characters from the myth. So I mentioned Helen, Penelope, but there's Odysseus in there as well, Aegisthus, Clytemnestra's lover, who was Agamemnon's sworn enemy and cousin. Leda, who was Clytemnestra's mother and is quite well known in the myth and in art as well for being the queen the god Zeus seduced in the form of a swan. So this novel is really about Clytemnestra's ascent to power. It is about the relationships that she had and formed with these people. And I would say that in a nutshell, it's about ambition, female ambition, empowerment, sisterhood, family, obviously loss and revenge, but also love and hope. It's quite a brutal book, but there's hope in it as well. And I would say that it's perfect for people like you who are big fans of these retellings, fans of the Greek myth, lovers of the classics, but also for people who don't know anything about these stories.
Oh my gosh, what an amazing just kind of overview of the story. And one thing that's like to me very interesting is, as I mentioned, I'm a huge fan of mythology, and a big part of it was my kids are actually doing Greek mythology now, and they're in second grade. And I know, they're not really doing like the brutal stuff, like, so some of like the like the story of like Leda and Zeus and anything like that, but they are learning who the Olympians are, which led them to want to have read to them the Percy Jackson books and all of that. And for me, I did not do Greek mythology until seventh grade, and that was really the first time I started hearing about goddesses, and I thought that was amazing. I was like, oh wow, these deities that are female. However, when you're reading myths, yes, a lot of the women in the myths are either those archetypes of like Penelope, but more so they are kind of like cast as these foils against I like to say the adjacent hero or the adjacent god, who they sometimes help and then are cast aside and suddenly take revenge, and they're considered these horrible people. So Clytemnestra is like a bold choice because she is definitely villainized as like the worst. And I just loved how you characterized her in this book. Just from the very first moment you meet her, you are with her. You are running through, training with her. You are meeting her siblings with her. And she's such a strong voice. Did you have to build it, or did she kind of come to you immediately?
Well, first of all, I love the question. And I just want to add that, as you said, there are so many extraordinary heroines from the Greek myth. Think, Antigone, who stands up to a ruthless king to ensure a proper burial for her brother. Or think Ariadne, who basically helps and saves the hero Theseus. The same thing with Medea, who does the same with Jason, as well as Circe. Why Clytemnestra? I think Clytemnestra, to me, she's always been the standout character from the Greek myth. And that is because she might be an ancient character, but she's also a very modern woman. She is someone who refuses to submit. And because of that, she's hated and vilified. And the three things that really, that I found really inspiring as I kind of became aware of this character and her story were, one, that she ruled Mycenae. Like, she effectively was the ruler of Mycenae, of the city of Mycenae, for 10 years. And there's an extraordinary line in the ancient Greek play, the Agamemnon, which is basically about Clytemnestra, despite the title, where the elders, the counselors of Mycenae, tell Clytemnestra, Queen Clytemnestra, will respect your power. And the word they use, the ancient Greek word they use, is kratos, which means political power. And it is incredible that they use that word, with respect to a woman. So I love that she was a ruler. I love that she took a lover. So she was more interested in her own pleasure and her own life rather than, the way other people perceived her. She didn't care about other people's perceptions of her. And so she's a character who is, yes, treacherous, deceitful, scandalous, but she's also incredibly powerful. And all these qualities make her the perfect embodiment of men's anxieties about, women and power. So to answer your question, really, I just always saw these qualities as positive, not necessarily bad things. And so I tried to kind of highlight them in my book, and also to make her likable. I really explored her backstory as much as possible, because people often forget that Clytemnestra was a Spartan woman, and that's no small detail. So she would have known how to fight, how to wrestle, how to hunt, and most importantly, she was raised in a way in which she could perceive herself as a free, not free woman, but almost free. So almost as free and powerful as the men around her. And that is no small thing. That must have been a huge part of her character. So those were the things that I was interested in as I was writing the novel.
You also explore her relationship with her siblings, not just Helen, but Helen is a big part of it. So who are all of her siblings? Because, I know Helen, I know Castor, and it's not Pollux, right? It's
well, it is Pollux as well. So Pollux is the Roman name,
yes,
the Roman version
yes,
of the
exactly.
name, but in Greek it's Polydeuces.
Right. But there's others as well.
Others as well, others who are less famous than, Helen and Castor and Polydeuces. So Timandra is her younger sister, and I was really interested in writing her. She's not a big character in mythology, but she features in a fragment, an ancient Greek fragment by this poet Jessikah, who basically says that the three daughters of Leda, Helen, Clytemnestra, and Timandra, were unfaithful to their husbands because of a prophecy, basically. So I incorporated that prophecy in my novel, and I really explored the way in which these three women were kind of disobedient and rebellious in this kind of in this world ruled by men. There are two other sisters, less famous, just Phoebe and Philonoe, but they're not a big part of the story. I would say that the biggest players in the story are Helen, Castor, Polydeuces, and Timandra, so these four siblings, and the way in which their lives are connected with Clytemnestra's.
Yeah, I really, I have to say, I really liked Timandra. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Timandra,
yes,
yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah, she was really cool, and I don't want to say any more than that, because whenever she was on the scene, or when she first came on the scene, I was like, oh, I am going to like you. But one thing I thought was really cool also between Clytemnestra and Helen is sort of how you they had a close relationship, but then they also saw each other in this really interesting lens of jealousy. For obviously everybody talks about how beautiful Helen is. But as you mentioned, they're Spartan, and like everybody also talked about how smart and powerful Clytemnestra was. And while beauty is extremely, like and that's pretty much what Helen has always been defined as, that, and the fact that is she the daughter of gods? Although I believe in the myth, she and Clytemnestra, were they twins?
There were twins in the
two
myth.
twins, because she laid two eggs, and one were with Castor and Polydeuces, and the others Clytemnestra and Helen.
Exactly.
So,
and according to
go ahead.
And according to the myth, Helen and Polydeuces are immortal, whereas Castor and Clytemnestra are mortal, so the mortal offspring. But I changed that slightly. So I incorporated the myth in a faithful way, but also I gave it kind of a fresh spin. I'm not going to say more, just not to give any spoilers, because it's a big part of the narrative. This is a big part of the narrative as well.
Yeah.
But absolutely, yes, I was really interested in the relationship between Helen and Clytemnestra. And I love books where sisterhood is explored in a very like layered way. It just, one of my favorite books ever is My Brilliant Friend by Elena Ferrante, where the relationship between the two main characters is never described in an obvious way. So there's love, there's obsession, there's admiration, there's jealousy as well in there, which is to me a very realistic portrayal of two clever girls. So I wanted something kind of similar in the relationship between Helen and Clytemnestra. As you say, Helen is defined by her beauty, and beauty is a huge part of ancient Greek culture. There was even a saying in ancient Greek, kaloi kai agatsoi, which means literally like good and beautiful. So according to the ancient Greeks, in this period, a person who was beautiful was also good, which is a very toxic way of thinking about things. If you just say it out loud.
Yeah, for sure. Especially like, and it makes me think of the god Hephaestus, and like how he's like always considered so ugly, but I always felt really bad for him because he seemed decent. He was decent enough. Absolutely. He let his wife, I should say, Aphrodite will do what Aphrodite will do, but he just kind of allowed himself to sort of play the fool and be like, fine, if you marry me, it's cool. I won't question who you're with, because I'll just be grateful that somebody as beautiful as you would be with me. Yeah. So yeah, that's a good point.
It is part of their whole mindset. But again, as you said, the first part of the novel is set in Sparta, and Spartan people had a different mindset compared to, the other ancient Greeks. And beauty, yes, it was important, but not as important as strength, not as important as power, as confidence. And Clytemnestra, she's never necessarily described as beautiful. Actually, in the ancient sources, she's often described as manly. And I think this comes from her Spartan background. But she has all these qualities that her sister Helen does not possess. And obviously that dynamic creates like a lot of drama in the novel. And I'm not going to say more again, because it's really hard not to give any spoilers.
I know. If you know a little bit about the Iliad and the Odyssey, you know a little bit of spoilers, but there's so much is fleshed out. I love it. So really, another thing that I thought was really cool is your early glimpse at Penelope and Odysseus. I really appreciated that. That was just a really nice note, and it expands really nicely. That was fun. Did you always kind of have them as part of the scene earlier on?
Yeah, so I knew that I wanted to have very famous characters from the myth in my novel, but I also knew that that was going to be one of the hardest bits to write and explore, because obviously everyone knows, and it's the same thing with Helen, really. So everyone knows about Helen, everyone knows about Odysseus, but people are usually interested in them as archetypes. So Helen as the beautiful one, Odysseus as the cunning one, and Penelope as the faithful one. So I think my approach to that, to writing these characters, was really showing all the layers underneath. So in my case, Odysseus, like I personally really like Odysseus. He doesn't come across as a good person in my novel, but I do like him. But the thing that most portrayals of him have in common is that he is someone for whom the ends justify the means. He doesn't really care about other people, only about himself. So that was my starting point to kind of portray Odysseus. And I also wanted him in the novel because I love the fact that Clytemnestra is a cunning character too. So I was interested in showing few similarities between these two characters. Actually, interestingly enough, Clytemnestra's name, according to some versions, means the one who's famous for her cunning. So I just really love the idea of having a lot of confrontations between her and Odysseus. And same thing with Penelope. I personally love the representation, like the kind of recent representations of Penelope in these retellings. Think like Ithaka by Claire North. I don't know if you've read it, but there's so many good ones, and I really wanted to kind of become part of that conversation and just have fun writing this character. While also, I will say this, while also being faithful to the sources, because for me it was important to write a book that felt true to the ancient sources, but also felt fresh in many different ways. So I want people to be entertained, but also to recognize characters, to be like, oh yes, I remember this Odysseus that we see here. I remember this Penelope, but also it is really hard to write a book when a lot of people know some of the events that take place. So I needed to make sure that, people kept turning the pages and kept being surprised.
When you were writing Agamemnon and Menelaus, so I like that you say that the Agamemnon play is really about Clytemnestra, because it is, and it just kind of makes me wonder. I'm like, well, I guess if they called it's supposed to be the tragedy of Agamemnon or something, like if they called it Clytemnestra, I guess that probably would have been giving heroism to somebody who.
True.
And I'm thinking about Antigone, but like that's a whole other thing. I'm like, she got her own play. She was the one, she had her own name in it. But for Agamemnon, there's so much there with him and his brother, and so many stories. Like, was Helen kidnapped? Did she go to Paris because she wanted to leave Menelaus? Was this whole thing, like, did you know who they were going to be in your novel immediately?
Talking about Agamemnon and Menelaus, you mean? Yeah, so I think the most interesting thing about these two brothers is the fact that they're considered heroes in, most accounts, but like great heroes, but also they're never depicted as good people. Like, there's not even one account. I mean, just think about the Iliad and Agamemnon in the Iliad. He literally causes the Greeks to lose battle after battle, all because he's arrogant, right? And the interesting thing about that is that the ancient Greek word hero was not necessarily, like, the Greeks did not think as heroes as we think. The heroes were meant to be arrogant. They were meant to be boastful. They were meant to be bad people. And that's quite interesting to me. So I wanted to lean into that as I wrote these two characters. And I also wanted to make Menelaus, and this is something, that I wrote, it's not necessarily in the ancient sources, a kind of better version of his brother. So he's not necessarily a bad person, not as bad as Agamemnon is. He's kind of a follower, whereas Agamemnon is a leader, but also not good enough to kind of deserve Helen's love. And in terms of my take on Helen's elopement with Paris, there's so many different versions of that myth, which is, to me, incredibly fascinating. And the one that I love is, the idea that Helen did run away with Paris because she didn't want Menelaus anymore. I mean, she does something incredibly rebellious for an ancient Greek woman. She abandons her daughter. She leaves her daughter behind. She leaves her husband. She starts a war. So I was interested in giving her agency in that respect and making her kind of aware of what she was doing, rather than simply being kidnapped and letting her be, the victim. No, I wanted her to be like the main character in that storyline.
So that said, and again, I don't want to talk more because I don't want to get into spoilers. As we mentioned, if you know some of the myths, you know some of the things that are going to happen, but there's also things that bring, like the meat of the story is juicy and awesome. You use the idea of prophecy a lot. Can you talk a little bit just about how prophecy fit into the culture back then and how you used it for the story?
Absolutely. So prophecies had a huge role for the Greeks, especially in the Bronze Age, and the same thing with gods and goddesses. So the spiritual, religion played a huge part. I think at some point in the novel, Paris says, my people are deeply religious. So if a prophet, if a seer tells them to do something, they will do it. And so I was interested in having that portrayed, having that on the page, in contrast with Clytemnestra's agency, in contrast with the main character's agencies and will, because Clytemnestra is a very willful character. She doesn't really believe in prophecy, and you see this throughout the novel. And so I was interested in kind of showing these two forces, one against the other. And I think throughout the novel, Clytemnestra's idea of prophecies changes slightly. What starts out as something negative for her becomes then positive. And there's, I think, two kind of big elements that are connected to prophecies in the novel. One is the priestess's prophecy in Sparta. I'm not going to say what it is, but this big prophecy is delivered to Clytemnestra's mother, as well as Clytemnestra and Helen, when they're quite young, and it plays a big role in the novel. It comes back again and again and again. No matter what these characters try to do, it just comes back and gets them. And the other kind of big element related to religion and prophecies is the seer Calchas. So the priest of the Greek armies during the Trojan War. And obviously he was a character in the Iliad. He was a big character in the Iliad, and he's the man responsible for some of the most horrifying deaths in the myth, for some of the most horrifying sacrifices. And having him in the novel meant really diving deep into these people's obsession with divinity, obsession with gods and goddesses, and how their lives were. I mean, these people were incredibly arrogant, they were incredibly strong, but then when it came to, a seer delivering a prophecy, they would just abandon all their strength and they would just bow and do as he said. So in that sense, this is also an exploration of power through a different way, because Calchas, the seer, is incredibly powerful and he's a bad person as well. So I think I was interested in having a big contrast between the goodness, the agency of Clytemnestra, and someone as powerful and horrifying as Calchas.
So would you be writing another novel about mythology, set in mythology? And if so, what would you like it to be if that is the case?
So I can't really talk about that, otherwise my agent is literally...
Oh no, we don't want. Okay, so
no, I'm not going to give you details. I'll just...
That's fine. Don't want to upset the agents.
I am writing another novel. It's a very epic novel, so quite similar to Clytemnestra in that respect. It is inspired by an ancient myth, but I'm moving away from Greek mythology. So it's I'm exploring, because I'm really interested in ancient history in general, and one of the things that interests me the most is how myth and history come together. So with Clytemnestra, obviously it is a myth, but if you read the book, you see, I mean, you've read it, so you see how the whole myth is grounded in history, in historical detail, in historical research. And that's something that, I'm really passionate about. So I'm doing something similar, but focusing on a very different character. So again, it is a very epic book. It is about ambition and, empowerment, but just in a very, very different setting.
I'm so excited to read it, and I do hope that you come back and chat with us about it when it is out.
Would love to do that.
All right. So once again, this is Jessikah with Syosset Libraries Turn the Page podcast. I was absolutely thrilled and honored today to have our guest.
Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely. And check out I can't tell you enough that if you are a fan of, I believe there was Circe or Pandora or Ithaca or any of these books that, sort of there was a Medea one, wasn't there? Was there a Medea one?
Well, yeah, but that's quite, so not recent. Natalie Haynes is working on a Medea one, but I think, the big recent ones have been the ones by Madeline Miller, Jennifer Saint, so Ariadne. Again,
Ariadne, yes, Ariadne. That
yeah,
one was also fabulous. And I also really liked what she had done with the characters in that too.
She's amazing. Yeah, Jenny Saint is amazing. Absolutely, yeah.
So check it out. You're going to love it. And we are going to close this chapter of Turn the Page.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.